Welcome back to the Faculty Factory podcast. I'm here at Hopkins and I'm Kim Skorupski looking at my new friend, Dr. Michael Gottlieb. Hi, Michael.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Okay, folks, who is Michael Gottlieb? Dr. Gottlieb is a professor, recently promoted to professor, so proud, so happy, vice chair of research and ultrasound division director in the Department of Emergency Medicine at Rush University Medical Center in Chicago, Illinois, my favorite city in the whole world. And I was actually at Rush University Medical Center from 2003 to 2013. And so I'm so happy, and he's making me smile just looking at him. So how did I find Dr. Gottlieb? Well, in academic medicine around March, I think was a preprint. Yeah, it looks like March was a research report entitled Educational Podcasts. Effective content delivery timing on knowledge acquisition and retention. And of course, when I see podcast, I had to read it, and I was really thrilled to see it. And because there's not a lot of research in our area on podcasts and what the outcomes are associated with it. And so I read it and I just emailed him, and he was kind enough to say, "I'm sure, I'd love to be on the podcast." So Michael is going to tell us about, I guess, the genesis of this project. I think it's twofold. First of all, a newly minted tenured professor, way on a fast track, mind you, 2 young kids at home, he just told me, balancing lots of leadership roles. I wanted to learn more about the study about podcasts, but also I thought there are many lessons to be learned from Dr. Gottlieb on how he has managed to build and weave in scholarship with having a family, with being a professor and associate professor, going up for professor. That's a part-time job in and of itself, and the vice chair for research and division director and seeing patients. So I think we want to learn some lessons from him of how he manages to be it all and do it all. So again, thank you, Michael Gottlieb. Dr. Gottlieb, take it away. Tell us about this piece of work and how it came to be.
Yes, so this is a great example of taking a passion and carrying it through to a project. And I find that is often one of the driving forces, because when you're busy doing research for the sake of research, or for a number, some metric, or for something you have to check off, it's not enjoyable. It's not going to drive passion. It's just another thing you have to do in a busy day. This stemmed from a series of projects and ideas that our group was just really fascinated to learn about. So instead of being just another item I had to do, it was something that was a fun kind of additional direction, an additional something that brought more variety into my job and the opportunity to explore something. And what was kind of the nicest for this whole project was I remember sitting there as a resident and being told, "Why are you listening to podcasts? It's a waste of your time." I was like, "Okay. Why?" "Well, you don't learn anything from it." And then it started to spur into, he's like, "Well, I think we can learn some things from it. I think we have to figure out how we learn from it." And from there, we had a series. I think the nidus for this initial paper was probably about 3 years of different discussions and meetings and refining to get the study idea we really, really wanted to do. And that led to our first project, which was to randomize residents to whether they would listen to a podcast while either seated, totally undistracted, or while driving, because it all comes down to learning efficiency. As residents, as faculty, we're busy. We only have so much time. How do you learn both as a learner still learning the field in the first place, and then how do you learn as a faculty trying to keep up with knowledge and the ever expanding amount of information that you either did not know, or it's been far enough away that you've don't recall it as quickly? How do you learn this more efficiently? Well, I drive an hour to an hour and a half to work every day, and wouldn't it be great if I could use this time for learning? Now the counterpoint is, what if I'm driving and listening to this podcast, I'm getting nothing out of it? And now I'm taking away time that I could listen to music or do something else with this activity. And instead, I'm now listening to a podcast that's also not allowing me to change. So that was the challenge. We wanted to figure out, does that make a difference? Am I actually learning from this? And the cliff notes of this one is, yes, you do in fact learn about the same if you're sitting totally undistracted versus if you're driving. So that was our first project. That was the foray. That was the thing that started this series of future studies. And we really wanted to expound upon that. But that was the first thing, is find your area of passion, find the thing that's going to be valuable to you, and the thing that will bring value to other people. And that was the other hope that came out of this, was that it would provide an opportunity for other people to say, yes, this is a valid way of learning in a more efficient manner.
Well, First of all, Michael, thank you for that story, because what I love about your story is your conviction that someone saying, like, criticizing you, what are you wasting your time doing that? That kind of like is a gut punch or like a throat punch, like, whoa, 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 I'm wasting time? Huh. And my mind, of course, spins into, well, is it really wasting my time if I'm doing this thing that helps me relax, calm down, connects me, disconnects me? My mind goes there, but it also goes, well, who are you to tell me that it's nobody learns from podcasts? I remember having a conversation years ago that someone said, you need at least 3 or 4 hours of a seminar or a workshop or class to learn anything. You can't learn anything less than 3 or 4 hours. And I thought, well, golly, if we have to do all of our faculty development content in 3 or 4 hours, game over, man. Faculty don't have 3 or 4 hours to go to a time management seminar. Learn how to manage your time in 3 or 4 hours. I said, my gosh, it has to be briefer than that. Well, you can't learn it. There's nothing to be gleaned in less time than that. And I think, gosh, I go to conferences all the time. I read books, I listen to podcasts. I learn things in snippets. And it reminds me of my faculty affairs colleagues back at the AAMC Group on Faculty Affairs Professional Development Conference years ago, developed these snippets, these short little recorded, really heavy, rich in content, little recorded sessions. And then recently on this podcast, if you've been listening, Dr. Anna Handorf at Harvard, they have this thing called Tiny Talks. It's amazing. They built a whole curriculum, 28 videos using a template on Tiny Talks. So all this to say, Michael Gottlieb, that good for you for taking the criticism and having the challenge put in front of you for someone to actually say, no good, not working, to go, oh, challenge accepted. And I hope you'll tell us more, because my first question is, you said people did learn regardless of whether they're in a car or being undisturbed, sitting alone. But what was the content of the podcast? So if it's some kind of silly podcast, you specified like what is the level of podcast and what is the content that they're teaching. So can you tell us about that type of learning, the type of podcast, first of all?
Absolutely. And to step that back for a second too, this concept of how many projects really come out of someone telling you no, or what we can maybe affectionately call the spite projects, where someone tells you, you can't do that. And you're like, yes, I can. It is amazing how much knowledge comes out of that, because it's a form of dogmalysis, right? You take dogma and someone said it's always been this way, and you say, but why? It's like channeling my inner 3-year-old, and I'm just saying, but tell me why. The sky's blue. Okay, explain to me why. And I'm going to push you down the prism effect and everything else, because I want to know the why of the why of the why, and to prove that that's still true. So that led to this. And one of the reasons we spent quite a bit of time building into this project was to make sure that we did it as robustly as we could. And so starting off the content of the podcast, these were built around, this was a podcast for emergency medicine residents. Okay. So we took emergency medicine abstracts, which is an online, well-established podcast forum for discussing critical articles from other fields that apply to emergency medicine. And we selected an equal number, about 5 per group, and we had them using a crossover model so that each person would serve effectively as their own control. We went through a few different mechanisms, including talking to all the sites. It was conducted across 4 sites. Each of the sites, we talked to their residency leadership to make sure that none of the articles were covered by journal clubs, that we made sure that they didn't show up in any FAAEM searches. We made sure that they were backdated, so they weren't in recent, in the recent literature. They had to have been back at least 4 or 5 years. Then we took the podcast from there. We developed a whole set of questions, multiple choice questions. We piloted them. We went through psychometric testing. We narrowed that field down. We balanced them across both groups. And then we trialed them. And that was one we ended up using for that. So it was about probably at least 6 to 9 months of pre-work to build that question set out with an amazing psychometrician. Shout out to Chachi Feng, who was just a phenomenal resource and brought that expertise to help us to make sure that we were really, really robust in how we approached this.
Wow, 6 to 9 months. This is good. I like how you're setting this up for us so people can see how this project is done. So How did you find Dr. Fung? So you say really great psychometrician, because I think part of what you're saying here, and I'm looking at your author list in the academic medicine research report, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of you. How did you, when you were given this challenge, gauntlet was dropped, and you're like, all right, if I want to do this, who do I need to have on my team? How did you go about assembling your team? Or was it people going, oh, you know who we need? We need this, we need that. Like, how did that evolve? Or did you kind of have a good sense of, all right, here's my team. I'm picking out my Olympic team and let's rock and roll. Or did it happen iteratively?
So it was a little bit of both. There was our core team that first began this was Jeff Riddell, Rob Cooney, and Andy King. We've worked on probably dozens of papers together, had a longstanding, connection from that. We were also trying to be, as we built it out, be relatively thoughtful in terms of geographic distribution of programs, because if I choose 3 programs in Chicago, it may not reflect the broader community. And so we started off and said, okay, now I've covered Ohio State, I've covered USC, LA County, and I've covered Rush and Chicago. From there, we wanted to expand out a little bit further. We made sure that we were balancing out across the types of programs. So, for example, Geisinger is a community program. LA County is a county-based program inherently in the name. And so we went from there, and then Andy came from Ohio State as a more of a academic tertiary care, kind of like Rush is. I was fortunate enough to meet Chachi Fung. She works alongside with Jeff at USC LA County, and so she's like I said, a brilliant psychometrician who brings in this the robust experience. This is something that she does, and she lives in this world. And then from there, we brought in Mary Haas as well, who is out of University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. She ended up joining into study number 2, which is the follow-up we'll probably talk about a little bit later, which was exercise, bringing further diversity of program types and trying to really be adding a new site to add some complexity into this as well. And so that was kind of our nice of this. And like I said, it was a combination of identifying people that we work really well together, people that this entire team are good friends of mine. And so it was really enjoyable there, but also being strategic and selecting programs that are going to give us the information we need and that we know will have a track record of highly reliable recruitment, which was something else important there. Because if you have a program that has low recruitment, not only is it hard to get your numbers, but it also starts to raise issues of, is there selection bias? Are there going to be factors playing to that? So knowing that we can recruit the vast majority of programs, that we had distribution of 3 versus 4-year EM programs, because that's something relatively unique to emergency medicine, that we have different lengths of programs to really account for all those factors. We were trying to be as strategic as possible as we select their programs.
Very comprehensive protocol. I really pleased that you said we had written dozens of articles together. So that told me, yeah, this is a solid team. And that is such a beautiful thing. I think if I'm thinking of advice for early career faculty members, is try to find your people, right? And gather a trusted circle of colleagues who match or complement first of all, definitely your passion and your creativity and your curiosity, but match your skills and complement your skills and strengths such that you're not all the same type who just likes to muck around in data, or we don't all like to look at literature. Someone's in the literature, someone knows the data, someone like do the graphics, someone's great writing, someone can bring the whole thing up with a wonderful, beautiful, elegant discussion. Someone can do, the psychometrics. And so that is a really good, smart, strategic skill to recognize what areas of expertise you need, rather than saying, well, I guess I have to go get another master's degree. I guess I got to go learn biostatistics. I guess I have to learn epidemiology. Maybe not. If you have people who bring that forte to the group, and now you're rocking and rolling, you have a history of dozens of papers, you know the strengths of each other, you know how each other works, you're respectful of timelines, and that is like, you get that machine going. I remember when I was reviewing grants, these shops, the shops were cranking out so many grants. I'm like, how do they do it? It's a well-oiled machine. It becomes formulaic almost. It's easy. So I like that you're underscoring the fact that it's so important to get a group of people. But then you also said something very important that I also want to underscore, is that some sensibility of having some kind of boundaries, or I'm thinking of the bowling lanes. You don't want to get too far in the gutter, not that work we do is in the gutter. You don't want to get too far afield that you're like, wait a minute, is this going to take us so far off track that maybe one of us might have someone would question our CV, go like, why are they doing that? Where did that come where you have treading on the potentially problematic a reputation of being a mile wide and an inch deep versus more focused. So I think, I like how you also raise the idea that bring the concept back and say, hey, does this sound intriguing? Are we passionate about this? Does this have a meaningful impact potential? Will this move the field? Will this help us in our careers? Is it doable? So all those kind of business strategy questions, it sounds like you have an MBA, or you want to get an MBA, or you're a natural MBA person.
So the last piece, I want to add another layer into that, because I love that. That's such a critical thing. This started off as a singular item where we said, all right, this is a single item. We want to try to understand this, the use of podcasting and driving. And even as we were designing study number 1, very much in our mindset was, okay, what's study numbers 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 down the line? And that's one of the areas where you avoid, or at least try to reduce that risk of that, mile wide, inch deep phenomenon. Because if you do one passion project and then one totally different passion project, 2 things happen. 1, it's hard for people to figure out who you are and what you want to do. And equally, every single time you start something new is a huge lift. The background work, the understanding of the literature, the understanding of the context, how to actually operationalize it. Study number 1, like I said, took years of planning, 6 to 9 months for the questions alone. And then study number 2, we were able to plug and play because we knew what we wanted to do. We had to make some nuanced changes to it. We, as we'll talk about probably in the most recent paper, we flipped the order to do some pre-planned secondary analyses. We were thinking about steps number, 1, 2, 3. And even after this study, we did some work looking at cross-sectional work on podcasts, looking for disparities and coverage of topics. And so we took something and we said, all right, project number 1. And we were trying to be as deliberate as possible each step along the way to say, what's the next project? How do we carry this forward? How do we advance the field? How do we build this knowledge so it's not just a single block, but it becomes a tower?
Super smart. And gosh, what a way to build an agenda or a program of research so that you're carving out building blocks where people who are ahead of you or a few rungs up the ladder from you can see the thread, they can see where you're going. And people who are just starting the field, the early career people, can say, oh, this is how you build. One carves a path or makes a path. The building blocks going in. I think that's a really great strength and a gift you have. I'd be curious, your Clifton strengths. One of your top 5 has to be strategic, because that is really, really smart of you and the team to say, okay, let's make sure this isn't a one-off. How do you parlay this? You're not going to wait till one big, as my buddy Dave Houston talks about, don't wait for the Hope Diamond, one big manuscript, that's probably a purposeful slip of the tongue. One big manuscript in Science or Cell or Nature, and then it might take 10 years versus the little diamonds, carving out little diamonds of what can make sense without being the what do you call them? The zirconia. You don't have cubics. You want to make sure that they're substantive diamonds, but that whole idea of some people wait for the big grand poobah of papers, and other people say, no, let's talk about this sequentially and what would make sense. And then you're building opportunities for others on your team to lead on, oh, I'd love to explore this in underrepresented medicine faculty, or I'd love to explore a twist using this kind of a platform. And then people coming up the ranks reading your literature could say, oh, have you ever thought about doing this in underserved populations and communities? And oh my gosh, for patients. So I love how you've described how one can build a whole agenda and a portfolio that not only helps you and the team, but successive generations. Great job, Dr. Gottlieb.
No, I appreciate it. And looking at that, people often imagine that this major paper, the New England Journal or the Cell paper, that is this huge accomplishment, that this was this one thing. But it's rarely that. It's a series of micro projects to get there. Unless you are extremely lucky, the vast majority of the time, it's something where you've been building over years and years and often decades to get to that point. It's the pebbles that build the stones that then build the giant rock that can house the diamond. But to get to the diamond, you have to do that preliminary work. You have to build that. And whether it's going after grants, whether it's going after the big paper, I would encourage 2 things. One is appreciate that it takes a lot of the pre-work to make sure you just understand the field and that you're doing the right job for the big paper. Because if you don't have a nuanced understanding of from understanding the base pieces, it's very possible you may just not answer the question the way you want to or the way it could best be asked. The other thing I would encourage is thinking more about the journey than about the outcome. Channeling it in my inner growth mindset is along each of these ways, I learned to be a better trialist. I learned how to understand, psychometric testing of questions. I learned how to write better questions. So every time that I brought people on, I brought a lot of people who are brilliant on this team so I can learn from them.
Mm-hmm.
It's great that they're all friends and they're all amazing investigators as well, but I also wanted to learn from all the areas of expertise. And so each of the different people in this team, I selected in because I wanted to learn from things they could do well. And I think that we sometimes miss that opportunity. And I see that often in terms of when we evolve, for example, a statistician for a project. You say, I need a statistician to help me run the analyses. And yes, you can get your paper out that way, but I think we miss the opportunity to say, I could use the statistician to teach me how to understand and run these analyses myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you get a much better value back for that. And yet we don't often do that because we get so focused on the next project or getting that project out that I would love us to be more active in our learning throughout the process and not just the product at the end.
I love that, Dr. Gottlieb. I really appreciate you saying that because I remember bemoaning the fact of using statisticians and database managers as like a drive-through fast food window of like pulling up to the first window and tossing your shoebox full of data and then say, run a structural equation model, a couple OLS regressions and a linear regression and get me some binary and make some moderating interactive terms and I'll be at the next window, hurry up with it. And you run to the next window and expect them to, stuff a data table at you versus building a relationship, as you talked about, a truly transformational collaboration of, hey, I'm thinking about, this is a hypothesis. I'm trying to hone in on the survey instrumentation, and these are the questions. And then that statistician, database manager, whomever will say, well, you know what? I hear what you're saying. If you ask the questions this way, you will only be able to do logistic regression. You're not going to be able to do linear because you're asking a yes/no question versus a Likert scale or or continuous variable and helping us understand the types of data and then the types of analyses that accompany those types of data that will then either restrict or open up an interpretation of those data. So it's so, I think that in addition to overlooking the learning we can do from each other, I think in our haste, we overlook potentials to improve our own science by not capitalizing on the true strengths of, like, for example, a medical informationist, who back in my day, we used to call librarians. Medical informationists are geniuses. They have their hands on databases that the public does not have. They don't just have PubMed, they have like PubMed on steroids. And if you don't use that or know about that, you're behind the eight ball. They can help us with our science in the beginning versus tacking it on at the end. So thanks for describing your process. It's so, so important. And I love that insight. Could you, if you're willing, could you tell us, how are you able to do this? You mentioned, and obviously you got promoted to professor pretty quickly. How are you able to do your clinical work, be the division director, do your scholarship, vice chair research? How are you able to do all this? Any special hints or do you have a doppelganger or do you have a personal assistant? Do you have a support crew that follows you around and does like menial labor for you, Keebler elves? Do tell. How does it work for Dr. Michael Gottlieb?
Yes. So no, I don't have an admin assistant and so kind of manage all these things myself. What I found is it's all about teams. It comes back to teams. When I look at the kind of, several projects that are often running at a given time, and I'm usually running about between 8 and 15 projects at a given time, it is not one team managing 8 to 15 different projects. It's 8 to 15 different teams. So each of the teams is able to run, which means we distribute our efforts out a little bit more broadly. It means, from my end, it means I'm not overtaxing a team member to do 3 or 4 projects at a time, especially if it's not ideal for their life at this time. And at the same time, it means I'm able to start distributing out knowledge. And one of the big goals I have with any type of project I'm working on is that I want our team as a whole to evolve, and that eventually any team I'm a part of, especially if I'm coming in as more of a mentor role or kind of a more senior role in the team, that eventually learns to survive without me. And that should outlive me, because that's how we advance knowledge. It's not in any of us, it's not in any one person. It's how do we advance it across our field, and how do we advance it across our specialty? And by doing so, we need to build that capacity. And what happens then is a side effect of that building of the capacity is now, instead of me being the driving effort, and early in my career, I was the driving effort, I think, for the vast majority of studies of being just boots on the ground. I'm going to make this work. That is neither sustainable nor is that a good long-term model. What I'm now in is I have teams that will create ideas, they will design these projects, and they'll pull me in to help advise, mentor, edit, and help guide through this process. But I'm not having to lead as much, which means that I'm not leading 8 to 15 projects anymore. I'm now able to lead some of my passion projects, things I want to carry forward and develop. At the same time, I'm able to help mentor and support and allow these teams to kind of be successful in building these projects out in these series of projects. And so that's, I think, really helpful, is building those teams and then galvanizing them over those series of projects. So just like how we have podcasts, we have a whole team called Direct that is led by a few of us. And we give a shout out to Lexi Max and Melissa Parsons at University of Florida, Jacksonville, who are leading this, which is diversity, equity, inclusion initiative to understand how we can improve DEI and really DEIB within higher education. And so that was something that started off as one project, and we've now had 15 papers, a grant, and has built across 9 institutions. It is a massive endeavor that stemmed out of one project, but it's the team that carries it forward. And I think that's where we need to really invest in, is building these teams, these sustainable teams that ideally outlive us, to focus on the bigger picture: is how do we advance science, how do we advance our field, and how do we advance our future leaders.
But Dr. Michael Gottlieb, what about our egos? How in the world can I possibly allow all these teams to do all these things on their own? Won't I lose my power? Won't I lose the authority? Won't I miss out on getting the kudos for doing this? Where do you put your ego when you let go of these teams? Aren't you worried that everything's going to get messed up? And I'm obviously playing devil's advocate here, because that would make a lot of people really squirrely about having all those pieces and parts out there, and you just kind of stepping back. It sounds to me like you were probably never a person who, well, you're not a glory hound looking for all the, I'm the king of the world. And yet, how do you get over that kind of like, maybe anxiety of like, geez, that kind of went left field. How did that team drop the ball on that? How do you get over that? I guess it's the ego, and the being able to say, no, this is going to outlive me. I got to let this go. How do you know when to do that, how to do it? Can you just shed some light on that whole issue?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. And I want to separate out 2 pieces of that. I want to talk first about ego and then about control, because I think those are slightly different pieces. For the ego, that is both one of the harder and easiest parts. It's just aligning what you value. Do you value the paper, the name, the thing you could put on your fridge? Or do you value what comes out of this that's bigger? Do you value the science? Do you value the ability to sponsor someone? I take great pride in people that are my friends, my mentees, that have grown and led papers. That is actually much more intrinsically enjoyable to me than the paper that I led, because I get to see the future as that evolves through them. And I think it's a great opportunity for us to sponsor others. And I would encourage us to just step back from the goal of this outcome of, I must publish this thing, to how do we advance the field? How do we advance others? And it's really fun to watch this evolve. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. This has actually been one of the most enjoyable parts of these teams, is watching the people who were starting out and were a little more timid and were kind of almost in like the periphery of our community practice, and then entering into the center. And now they're the centerpiece. Now they're the one that everyone else is hovering around, and you see that evolution. That's unbelievable. It's so incredibly cool. So that's the first thing, is I think separating out that ego piece of it and being okay that it's no longer about you. It should be way past us. It's about other people. It's about our field. It's about the science. Now the control piece is, oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Before you go off of here, because my little brain, it'll fall right out if I don't ask you now. When you say that, I'm thinking some people listening to this might say, well, it's all right for you, Dr. Michael Gottlieb. I just heard you're a professor. You're tenured. So you can easily say, oh, it's not about me. It's a legacy and being all selfless. And aren't you a wonderful person? gosh, I'm under the gun. I just got hired here. My practice is blowing up. Somebody just left. I'm taking on extra, clinics. I'm struggling. I'm told that I have to, I only have 20% of time for research, but I got to cover that next. I mean, how do I build these teams and give away that authority? I don't even have anything. How do I make sure that I get the credit for that? So how do you balance, or what would you say to someone who's coming to you with the whole, yeah, but, do they just kind of, tough it out and just, like you said, drill deep into their values and trust that everything will work out? Or where do you start off maybe playing your cards close and keeping control and then learning gradually when it's okay to start? Like do you remember, if you can look back, when you were an assistant professor probably 6 months ago, as you rapidly fired through all the stages?
So I would separate that maybe in a couple pieces. The first one is you have to understand what your needs are at your institution. If you have certain expectations from your chair or from your P&T committee, figure out the things you need to achieve those items, because those are external metrics that you have to meet. And so understanding just here are the things I need to achieve, great. That means that maybe a portion of your research does need to be led by you, and that's entirely fine. That's normal. And I would argue that if you're early in your career, you should be leading the research. That's the goal, is to learn it early so you can mentor others. The intention isn't to say from day one, I've never done a project before, I'm ready to mentor you. The goal is to say, I've never done a project before, I want to learn this, and I want to eventually get to a place where I can now mentor and pass that off. So I don't think that the people who are at the clinical instructor or the assistant professor stage should be necessarily primarily in this mentor step back role, because you miss the opportunity to be hands-on and learning it. But the goal is rather to not live in that forever and to be increasingly comfortable stepping that back and empowering others to take that lead, and then empowering them to empower someone else to take that lead. The other item I would encourage when you're able to work with a team, and it's sometimes easier when you have established teams because you know them all really well, but particularly when you have new members or you're building it, there's understand the team dynamics and understand the team needs and the expectations. If I have someone that, for example, is going up for promotion and tenure, I'm more than happy to help advocate and say, this is why they should be first or last author. And let me help them to make sure they're successful in that role. But I'm willing to put them on and put my ego very much aside to say, I can be wherever I am in the author order, because it's more valuable, more important, more meaningful to them. Or that is a person who traditionally has faced numerous biases throughout the institution and would get and is deserving of better, opportunities for equity within this. And so how can I work with them to ensure that there's better balance? You just need to understand your team and their needs. And so that first step of understanding where everyone's coming from, what they hope to get out of this, make sure there's a lot less friction, and also ensures that everyone is actually getting the things they need to be successful.
Oh, you are awesome, Michael. So you're not, that's a classic negotiation thing. It's not like a win-loss, like if I win, you lose. It's you're growing the pie. So you're literally living that. So tell us about the control aspect. So I learned about the ego. What do you value? So let's dig deep at what do we value, but how do we manage and wrestle with control?
Yeah, that is always an inherent challenge. That balance between I know how to do it really well, so I can micromanage you and make sure you do it exactly the way I want to. And yes, it will probably be successful, and you will learn very little, and you will never want to work with me again. Or I can give you complete free reign and say, here's the endpoint, get there however you'd like to. And I'm here to kind of as a curbside consult. And I think neither of those will ever be very successful. So you have to find your middle ground. You have to say, all right, how much can I bite this down to a meaningful size of here's where you need to get to, here's how you get to this endpoint, without overmanaging you, but giving you the skill sets, giving you the support, giving you the things to do it, and empowering you to be able to get there on your own. And that's where I found it works really well, is kind of being this almost this whisper in the ear. So I would liken this to, I'm an emergency physician by training. And so when I'm in the resuscitation bay and I'm at my academic site, I have residents in the room. And my goal is for the resident to successfully run this cardiac arrest without the nurses or the techs or anyone else looking to me, coming to me, but I'm there. And so I'll let the residents start to talk through their case, and they'll start to run the code. And when things start to get a little amiss and I can sense it, I'll whisper in there and be like, hey, do you think about giving this? And they'll make their plan. They'll announce it to the room. So it's still their ownership of this. And then they go back on track and leading it again. And so rather than trying to either take it over or step by step align and say, you must do this, I give them a little bit of a framework before we often almost universally will talk through what we're going to do before we walk in the room. And then I let them run that. And I'm sort of, to call back to your example of the bowling alley, I'm helping prevent gutter balls. I'm sitting there helping them keep it so relatively towards the middle of the lane. Do they get a strike? Great. Do they end up hitting a couple pins? They get 7-10 split? That's okay too, because they still got 8 pins, and that's awesome. I'm there to help keep them out of the gutter and let them get there the way they want to and support them along the way so that they feel the next time they're able to do it on their own, as opposed to I'm only able to do this when Michael's staying right behind me.
Look at you remembering that bowling metaphor. You're so smart. You should be a coach, Dr. Michael Gottlieb. I love it. You know what? I realized just now we've not really talked about your research. Can we circle back? I really want to hear more about the exercise and how you've taken the podcast into different content areas.
Absolutely. So the first studies I mentioned was looking at driving, and we found a couple of interesting things. And so big picture of this, number one, that for immediate retention, so we had them do the podcast, and then immediately after, within 30 minutes, they had to take a test. And we found there was no difference in the immediate retention. Then we held them to a 30-day delayed recall. And we said, okay, well, is there a knowledge decline? For both groups, there's a knowledge decline, not surprisingly, because it's a one-off 30-minute podcast and it's very information heavy. But they declined about the same rate. So we saw that the same thing. And the third thing, which I thought was kind of...
What did you say? They declined at the same rate?
Yes.
Their retention declined.
Oh, correct. Yes. So at 30 days, their retention declined compared to where they were at the initial recall, but it was by the same amount. So essentially at 30 days, they recalled the same amount, whether they were seated, undistracted, or if they were driving to work or some other activity. And the last one was we asked them the question of, how much do you think you retained?
Oh.
And what we found was that the group who was driving thought they actually retained less, when in reality they retained the same amount, because they perceived they were driving that was doing it. But in reality, when you test them, they know about the same amount. And so we carried this forward. We repeated the same kind of model with different learners, of course, doing this with exercise. And this was limited to aerobic exercise because we wanted things that would be semi-autonomous. We didn't want to have weightlifting or attending a cardio class because that has too many distracting variables. And I don't know anyone that wants to listen to a podcast and weightlift. So we took that out of the equation and we narrowed it down to aerobic, and we kept it inside just to remove the outside factors of, not running into people, not worrying about, tripping. So we wanted to keep it relatively safe in that regard. And unsurprisingly, we found almost the exact same results, down to the similar percentages, no difference in initial recall, no difference in 30-day delayed recall. And so similarly, turns out it doesn't make a big difference when you exercise, which is a fascinating one, by the way. For a mini backstory of exercise, exercise is one of the most controversial ones because it can help or hurt. Driving, everyone just assumed it would make you worse. No one was like, you're going to drive and learn more. That was never an argument. But exercise has two versions. It has a version where it amps you up, it triggers a sympathetic surge. Your brain's more happy, more alert, like drinking coffee before a podcast. You're now able to pay more attention, so you're going to learn more. Or I'm exercising, so I'm thinking about exercising, and I'm having my heart rate race, and I'm trying to keep my pace, and I'm going to be distracted and drop my knowledge. And it turns out, right down the middle, no difference. So it didn't seem like it helped or hurt, which is fine, because all I wanted to say was, can I do this activity while I'm doing something else? And if I want to exercise and listen to a podcast and double dip, turns out it's about as good as exercise as listening to a podcast totally undistracted.
So the inside exercise, were they like treadmill, you said bicycle, elliptical, that kind of stuff, rower? Okay.
Exactly. Anything that can be done as a continuous form of exercise. They had to listen for 30 continuous minutes. So it had to be something that was relatively aerobic and stable in nature. Same thing for driving, it had to be 30 continuous minutes.
Wow. Okay, got it. Geez, podcasts. Whew, this is it. I'm glad we're 5 years into this podcast. One of my colleagues, it was probably Martin Feeder. He's one of my dear colleagues and strongest critics. Like, is anybody really learning anything from this? I said, well, actually, the goal of the Faculty Factory is a community sharing tools to build leaders. It's not really meant to be like the tiny talks, Anna Handorf in Harvard, but gosh, you're inspiring me that maybe people are learning something when they're driving to work or sitting on the row or listening to Dr. Michael Gottlieb talk about how he's able to do all this. So that's very encouraging to me. So what's next, or what's the next series of this in this effort, or what's the next logical iteration of where we're going to take this in academic medicine for learning?
Yeah, so I'll give you a preview of one of our papers that's in review right now. That'll be hopefully the next one out. We use a driving simulator. So we said this is great in the theoretical environment or in the real world environment. It tells us that, but I want to understand how things differ when we introduce variables. And so we looked at specifically things like country versus city driving, lots of turns. And so we started to delve into this aspect at a little more granular level in a controlled environment. So we have some interesting findings that will hopefully be coming out in the near future.
Oh, goodness. And so what are the implications for us as learners, like the big take home, like what's the so what, or like for patients learning or content developers or anyone doing education, is a message that podcasts and maybe these tiny talks and little snippets of knowledge, 30 minutes, does suffice until we come to the red pill, blue pill, or like jacking our brains in at night to learn stuff? Is this like the future, or the way we should maybe invest more of our efforts in something that's more efficient, or that can be cross-pollinated or done simultaneously, multitasking? Like what is the theoretical foundation of your group? Like where are you leading us?
So I think three things come out of this when we look at the key elements. One is, if you want to listen to a podcast, you can listen to it while driving or exercising and probably retain about the same as if you sat there, completely undistracted. So we have some pretty good data there. With this piece number two, the caveat. And the caveat is how you do the podcasts. To be a little meta here, as we're talking, it's conversational, it's back and forth. This aspect of podcasts, there's some literature and it's evolving in how you can best use podcasts. It's 2 is better than 1. We don't know about 3. It's probably about the same as 2. But one person giving a long monologue gets distracting. So that dyadic conversation helps. Interspersing questions and pauses works. The interpolated questions that step in and say, let me ask you something, maybe pause your knowledge, helps to break things up a bit. In this specific podcast, we didn't insert questions within there because that was an endpoint. But what we did do is we had 5 different podcasts. And so they were listening to each one. And so there would be a topic, 2 people talking, pause, 2 people talking, pause, 2 people talking, pause. And so by introducing that gap and jump to a new topic, that helps to kind of re-engage people. And so there's some things in there that people can do with podcasts to make sure we're being clever with it. And the third one is, nothing is a panacea. We still had a relatively large decline in knowledge. People retained about 50%. And so what that means is that you're not retaining 100%. You have to understand that barrier. I think that's a really key thing. And we see that not just with podcasts, with reading, with other things, this sense of, if I check this box, I've accomplished it. If I read this book chapter, I now know more about this. But do you really? And I think that's where we need to use other measures, whether it be Anki cards and other things that test our knowledge, or just checking where we're at. Because I can listen to a podcast, and if I'm listening to a podcast and not really paying attention to anything, I will walk away saying, I am really knowledgeable now in bradycardia. I'm prepared for the next bradycardia cardiac arrest. And it turns out I wasn't paying enough attention, and I'm not going to retain it. And I now may study less than this area that I actually need to, because I felt like I ate my carrots, when in reality, I didn't really eat them. I just pushed them to the side of the plate.
False confidence, Michael. Ooh, I love that. Gosh, I've learned so much from you. I've always known I need to shut up and like not talk as much, but it's so hard for me to close my mouth. So pausing, oh my gosh, I have to embed more pauses in the podcast.
The idea that what you listen to needs to be what you retain. And so having some measure of actually assessing that what you listen to, you actually retain in a meaningful manner. Because if you don't, you're going to feel like you went ahead and you learned this activity, but in reality, you just heard it and you didn't retain it. And that means now you're not going to study it, and you may actually be worse off than if you never listened in the first place.
Right. So I just blanked out on that, but that was it, that false confidence, the aha, because when you were saying that, I'm reminding myself of so many instances where I listen to something and go, that's brilliant, that's genius. Or even in the podcast, I've said, oh yeah, I just heard somewhere, I don't know if I was watching a series on Netflix or it was a podcast or a book I'm reading or a conversation I overheard. I forget things all the time. And the excuse my friends and I make is that we've lived a lot longer. We have a lot more jammed in our brains to try to remember and recall things. So that's what is, I like to underscore, that is, we need to maybe boosters. So if we're seeking some kind of knowledge that is critical to our job performance, like you're saying, some procedure, we can't delude ourselves into saying, like when I say, for homework or to read this thing, and I'm scanning through like speed reading, I go, yeah, got it. I got it for about 30 seconds. I dare you to ask me in an hour what that was. I might be able to, go around the edges there. So I think it's important, that realistic expectation of, okay, if I'm listening to this podcast with a distinct intention to change my knowledge, my attitudes, skills, or behaviors, and practicing something, I have to be mindful of the fact that it's not a one and done. I can't just listen to it or read it and expect that I know it. And I'm gonna have to revisit it, the booster shot, keep going back and keep testing so that I don't have that drop off like kids over summer, when all of a sudden, the teachers are like, really? Didn't we talk about this last May? Yeah, but now it's September. We got to go back to doing our basic math. So I think that's something that I'm going to take home. One of the things I'll take home from this, Michael, is that as smart as we all are, as many degrees as we have, and we're all quick learners and we multitask and we do all these things, let's not have these unrealistic expectations and this false confidence. So those are great take-home points. I think that's so important. I love where you're going with this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that last piece too, when you talk about this kind of booster shots or effectively spaced repetition. And so when we're thinking through how do we best optimize podcasts, I like to keep in mind that this is still a passive form of learning. It can be semi-active. I can pause and have you reflect or have you create different type of mind maps, but in reality, it's still a mostly passive form of learning. And so we can even be strategic about how we use it. So it could be a booster shot to remind us, but it might actually be better as the initial inoculation to say, you know what? Let me frame this for you. Let me give you some food for thought. And then now you go apply this actively, and then you can come back to it. And so instead of using this passive form on the back end as a recall, it's actually sometimes really helpful in the beginning to say, okay, this is a really good framing. Now I can think through how to scaffold this out and go forward and say, all right, now I'm gonna dive more into this and have my work with a group or try to figure out how I can apply this knowledge in practice.
Do it, actually engage in the behavior. It's not enough. The initial outcome is changes in my knowledge, my attitude, my skills. And it's called initial outcomes using logic model language. But then changes in behavior is the doing. It's the knowing versus the doing, and then the being. I will be an expert in this once I'm doing it, which is scaffolded on top of knowing it. So we can't just stop with the knowing. Yeah, I know that. Yeah, do you really know it? Until you've done it, do you really know? Until you've done it, the 10,000 times, do you really know how to do it? So super important. Gosh, it's so important. I'm so glad I read your article. Thank you for writing this article. Thank you for doing this work and for sharing lessons about building teams and reminding us of checking our ego and our control at the door and really reflecting on why we're here. What do we value? What's important to us? And we're here for the science, for health of the population, and for learning. And I also like how you pointed out that, a lifelong learner and growth mindset. This is cool stuff. Dr. Michael Gottlieb, I'm going to leave the final word piece out to you. Any kind of parting thoughts or comments or reflections for the Faculty Factory International community?
That was a phenomenal summary. So I will not probably do great justice to adding on much to that. But what I'll say is find your passion, the thing that's going to drive you. That will find more hours in a day because it's something you want to do, something that drives you, whether it's a spike project or whether it's something you want that you are really just so enthused about. Find your passion, find your team. That's the team. That's the people who are going to help to expand your capacity, who help to advance our field, help to allow us to be more productive, but also to eventually be less productive, step off the teams and allow them to carry forward, and find your role and where your role is going to be within a team. And eventually the idea is that they should outlive you, and be comfortable kind of setting your ego aside and allowing other people to run with it, setting your control aside, allowing other people to get a little bit of a couple pins off the lane without a strike every time is okay. That's actually a big accomplishment for them. That is huge. And so being okay with that piece too. And you'll find that all the work ends up being a lot more fun, a lot more enjoyable. And the outcomes you have were probably different than when you started, but are much more meaningful.
Dr. Michael Gottlieb, thank you. See you next time on the Faculty Factory podcast.
podcast producer Casey Conlan here. Just wanted to make sure you were reminded that our newest Faculty Factory book, The Academic Medicine Starter Kit, Timeless Tips and Guidance for Early Career Faculty Members, is now available by visiting facultyfactory.org. You can find it on the home page there. I also wanted to remind you that this podcast that you're listening to, as of September 2024, has had nearly 89,000 total downloads and more than 15,000 total YouTube views. Faculty Factory website has drawn more than 49,000 web visits from users in 122 different countries, and we'd like to invite you to be a guest on our show. So please visit facultyfactory.org, send us a message there, or reach out to the show directly, facultyfactorykim@gmail.com. Please reach out there if you'd like to be a guest or to nominate someone in our academic medicine community to be a guest on our show.
Thanks for tuning in to Faculty Factory Podcast. The mission of the Faculty Factory is to build and support a community of leaders in faculty development who share tools, resources, wisdom, and encouragement in service to our faculty members, schools, and institutions. We encourage you to go to facultyfactory.org to find out more, get in touch with me, ask me any questions. Maybe you want to be interviewed on the podcast. Thanks for tuning in to Faculty Factory Podcast. We'll see you next time. The Faculty Factory podcast and website is sponsored by the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine Office of Faculty. For more information, visit facultyfactory.org.